So today is lesson 4 of Comp2084 server-side scripting with ASP.NET. Today is our second last class together, so we'll have class together this week and next week, and then Eduardo will be taking over after that. Just a reminder, you're going to be submitting assignment 1B in 2 weeks on a Tuesday on June the 22nd at 5 o'clock. I will still grade those, even though Eduardo will take over the instruction. I will be doing providing you with the grading and assessment and feedback for your assignment 1B. So the goal of today's class is basically to give you everything you need to go ahead and build your assignment. So we're going to talk a little bit about SQL Server. We did go through one setup last week, and we went through both the Azure and the local setup. But we haven't really connected the database up to our application. So we're going to want to connect to our database. We're going to use this particular class in .NET called DB Context. And then we're going to plan and design our database schema for our .NET Drinks store. We're going to generate some models, and then we're going to use this neat process in Visual Studio called database migrations. And what that will do is Visual Studio will take a copy of all the model classes we design, and it'll automatically generate a database schema in our database based on those models, including the relationships, all the one-to-many relationships between our different models. Then we're going to use another auto-generated tool called Scaffolding, where we're going to let Visual Studio build working controllers and views for us. So this is basically everything you'll need to do in order to get assignment 1B working. Now, usually I show this little 9-minute video as an intro to SQL Server. But typically when people take this course, they haven't worked with SQL Server before. And I know that this group is working with SQL Server in your advanced database course. So maybe instead of showing the video, let me just ask you, and you can use the chat, what do you know about SQL Server already? What are some of the features or benefits of using it based on what you've done with it so far in your advanced database class? What do you know about SQL Server? Yep, it's very scalable. Absolutely, Chris. So it's considered an enterprise level database system. It's user friendly. Okay. Yep, I agree. I think it's very easy to use. Thanks, Chris. What else do you know so far about SQL Server? You're in week 4 of your advanced database class, so I'm assuming you've learned a few things. It's a server which can help us store our databases, which we can do things like manipulating and adding data. Yep, absolutely. What are some of the reasons to use SQL Server as opposed to maybe a different database system? Why particularly would we use it in this course? Okay, yep, it's a relational database. That's true. Yeah, Connor, that's right. It's a Microsoft product. Yeah, and as Adam said as well, it integrates really well. So typically, we could use a different database if we're using ASP.NET for our web application, but this is the most common combination, an ASP.NET web application with an SQL Server backend. So the integration is great. Anybody have any idea how old SQL Server is? How long has it been around? Roughly. Why does that matter? Murilo, it's actually more than 20 years. I remember when SQL Server 2000 came out, and I was using SQL Server, I think version 6, even in the 90s. So it's a really mature product. So what are the benefits to that as a developer of using using software that's been around since, 20 plus years? Yeah, Cameron, you're right, in the 90s. Okay, yeah, it's got legacy functions. That's true. What are some of the other benefits of using? Yeah, there's lots of support, lots of documentation, right? Because it's been around, and where there's bugs, there's patches and fixes, there's tips and tricks. It also has a track record, right? We know that many organizations have been powering their applications with SQL Server for 25, going on 30 years now. So we know that there's this track record, there's this documentation. The product has stood the test of time. One of the other reasons why SQL Server is great for web applications is most web hosting companies, at least most traditional hosts, they really only offer two flavors of database for your web application. Most hosting companies will offer MySQL, and some will also offer SQL Server. But not many other database engines are supported by traditional web hosting companies. So it's very robust. It's got a very advanced security model, as well as a number of other great features. And one of those great features that comes with it is Management Studio, which we started to use, and I know you're starting to use in your advanced database course. Yeah, we've got huge storage space. We can scale it out, so we can distribute loads across multiple SQL servers for load balancing. We've got high volume applications.
Rich.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I watched the video you posted on the link on YouTube, and I saw the guy talking about performance, reliability. What else? I remember to see like four highlighted points.
Yep, performance and reliability absolutely are part of the benefits suite that we get when we're using SQL Server. Yeah, and as Connor's saying, SSMS is super helpful for creating and managing our databases. One of the other great things that you may have seen already in your advanced database class, SSMS has a query analyzer. So if we set up a complicated query, we can run it, and it will actually show us the performance of each join and each kind of journey, each leg of the journey of our SQL query, so we can fine tune them and optimize them for speed and performance. So the video is here. If you want to watch it, I won't spend class time, but it's a really good overview of the entire kind of ecosystem of SQL Server. In terms of how popular it is, as we'll see, SQL Server is one of the big three. So if we look here, current score on dbengines.com, Oracle, according to this ranking, and it is current, Oracle is still the world's most popular database engine, then MySQL and SQL Server, and really everything else is really nowhere close. Although MongoDB, which you'll work with later in your JavaScript framework course, it's starting to catch up, but these are really the big three, are Oracle, MySQL, and SQL Server. And fortunately, the skill set, Oracle and SQL Server are very close. There's not a lot of difference. So if you learn how to work with SQL Server and then you wind up working somewhere where they're using Oracle, you're not going to have a big transition to move to Oracle. Okay, so I just want to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to do today, and then we'll get our hands dirty and we'll do it. So when we're basically going to talk about what SQL Server offers. Well, we've basically done that. We set up a database already. We'll look at how do we configure our .NET Web App to access the database. And then how do we build our models in Visual Studio and use Visual Studio to then map those models into database tables. And then we want to scaffold controllers and views for performing create, read, update, and delete. So we've already looked at this. So we've got a few options for connecting to SQL Server. So we did this last week, and I'll do it again. So I'm going to open up Management Studio. And first I'm going to connect to my local instance, and then I will also connect to my Azure instance. So it defaults to whatever the last connection was whenever it opens. So here's my computer name. My server is set to use SQL Server authentication with a login and password. If you set up your local server to use Windows authentication, then you don't need to provide any credential. You're just logging in with your Windows login. And if you can't see your computer name here, under server name down at the bottom of this drop-down list, there's an option that says Browse for More. And if you expand the database engine, this would be your computer name or your local server. Now, somebody emailed me the other day and said, I tried to do this, and when I went in here, there were no servers showing. Like, couldn't find my computer. If you come in here and you've installed SQL Server, and yet you don't see your server, then that might mean you've installed SQL Server on your computer, but the service isn't running. Now, by default, it's set to run automatically when your operating system boots, but there's a way you can check this. I'm just going to show you. So in your search bar, if you type services, this will load all of the services that run in your operating system. And if I scroll down to SQL Server here, it tells me the status is running and the startup type is automatic. So if your SQL Server doesn't show up in Management Studio, you can look in the services, and if it's not running, all you have to do is right-click, and then you'll have the start option. And that'll start the service running. And if the startup type is manual or disabled, you can also toggle it to automatic. So SQL Server is going to run automatically every time you boot your operating system. So then I can just click connect, and SSMS opens my local server here in the Object Explorer, and I can see the different databases that I've got. So here's the .NET Drinks database we created last week. If I want to look inside, it's just empty right now. The other thing, our other option was to connect to create the database in the Microsoft Azure portal, and then to allow all remote IP addresses in, and then I would connect with the server name we created in the Azure portal, which will have a suffix of database.windows.net, and then we would have to enter the username and password that we created for ourselves in the Azure portal. So I also have that one. Here's my .NET Drinks database that I created last week in class. So now I've got two versions. Here's my live online database. Both of them are empty. So I have a .NET Drinks that runs on Azure. I've also got a .NET Drinks that runs locally. For today, I'm going to use my Azure database. In later classes, I'm just going to use my local one. Okay, and these slides with all of these instructions, they're all posted here for you on Blackboard, week 4 slides. So all this stuff that I'm going over, that you have access on Blackboard. So let's look at, I want to go through the process of how then do we connect these things up. So I'll walk through the slides and we'll do it after. So you'll notice in our app settings.json, when we created our project, we'll just open up our .NET Drinks project. I'm not going to modify it yet. I'm just going to show you where this is. So our MVC template includes a configuration file called appsettings.json. And in there is a space for database connection strings. I'll just open my project, and you can open yours as well. I'll open my Solution Explorer, and down here at the bottom, I have appsettings.json. So it's a JavaScript configuration file, and you'll notice there's already a section here called connection strings with a connection called default connection. Now, right now, it just sets up a local database file name, but we don't want to use this. I want to use either my local database or my Azure database. So what we'll wind up doing is we're going to replace the connection string. And I've given you 3 options. So if you're using your local server and Windows authentication, the connection string will look like this. And you'll just replace the computer name and the database name. And instead of a username and password, we just have this integrated security equals true. So that means you're using your Windows login. So wherever I've put values in italics, those are variables that you'll change. Your computer name and your DB name. If you're connecting locally with SQL Server authentication, the first part is the same. Server equals your computer name. Database equals your database name. But then instead of this integrated security equals true, then we've got a user ID. And notice there's a space in user ID and your password. So this would be how you would connect locally. And if you're using Azure, which is what I'm going to do today, I'm going to use this version. And this is also the version of the connection string you'll use in your assignment. Server equals, and then it'll be your Azure server that you created in the portal, .database.windows.net, and then your database name, your username, and your password, all of which you've created in the Azure portal. So you've got the syntax for that connection string, the 3 different versions here. Now, ASP.NET gives us a class of an object type DB context. This is a database connection class. And we've already got this class in our project. If we go and look in Solution Explorer under Data, we've got a couple things in this folder. We've really sort of ignored it till now. We have an application DB context. So this is a class. Notice it references Entity Framework. Entity Framework is the data access library that .NET uses. Much like when you had your PHP class, we used a library called PDO. That was a data access library that let a PHP site talk to some kind of database. Well, in the Microsoft world, we don't use PDO. The data access library is called the Entity Framework. So we're referencing Entity Framework, and this is our class. So this code will work as it's written. We don't have to change this class at all. It's already here. And so how does, and this connection object actually is going to get passed in when our application starts. And we can see this in our startup file. So there's some code Visual Studio wrote. Notice here under this method in startup, under configure services, we've got this line, services.addDBContext. So we're providing this connection class and setting up the options that this is connecting to SQL Server, and it's using the connection string called default connection, which we've got here. So we don't actually have to write any of this code. All this code is already here. It's already functional. The only thing we'll have to replace is the value of our connection string. So this, again, is lots of other stuff in Visual Studio development. It saves us lots of time. The only thing we'll have to do with this file, with our application DB context, we have to list all of the models in the application. So right now we've got a brand model. So we're going to need to list that model here and make it readable and writable, as well as the other models we're going to create. So first, let's go ahead and add our connection string. So I'm going to use my Azure connection string. So I'm going to go to my app settings.json, and I'm going to start changing these values. So my server is going to be .NET drinks.database.windows.net. So you can use whichever server you used last week to set up your database. If you're using Azure, that's fine. If you're using your local server, that's fine too. My database is called .NET Drinks. And then I'm going to have my user ID equals and password equals. So I'm just going to put in my credentials. Only the password is case sensitive. The other items are not, Booper. Good question. So I'm just going to pause my screen. I'm going to go back. I need to go and find my credentials. Fortunately, I put them in a file last week. Okay, so I'm going to connect to my Azure database. Here's my server, .NET Drinks.database.windows.net. My database is called .NET Drinks. My user space ID, and then I put in my password. So I'm going to run my application. I'll choose the debug menu and start without debugging. And again, you don't have to use Azure for this. After this week, I'm going to switch my connection string and just work locally for my .NET Drinks. In your assignment, your database will have to run on Azure. Okay, so my site loads. Let's see what happens if I put in an invalid server. I'm just going to save that change and see if my site will still load. It might, because we're not really using the database yet. That's okay. So again, if you need the syntax for the connection strings, you can find those on slide 8. In the week 4 slides. Jason, that's a really good question. I've never tried. Try it and let me know. Normally, for local, you either put in the computer name or in brackets, local. Okay, you can also use 127.0.0.1. So that also should work for local. But good to know. Thanks, Jason. Good tip. I love having students that are smarter than me. I've taught this class probably 25 times, and I always learn things from my students. That's awesome. Great suggestion. So now we get to one of the magic parts. Okay. So we've got one model, right? We've got this brand model that we created. So Visual Studio lets us generate tables that are mapped to all of our models. So we don't have to go into SSMS and manually create a brand table or write an SQL script to generate this table. So Visual Studio uses this tool called a migration. So we only have to do 2 things to get this to work. First thing, actually we can run the migration now. So we want to let Visual Studio build a brand table that has an ID, a name, and a year founded column. So how do we do this? If you click on your Tools menu and go to the NuGet Package Manager and pick the Package Manager console. So this is like a Visual Studio command line window. Normally it's used for installing third-party libraries and packages, which we'll do later. But for now, we want to run a command to generate a table in our database. So I'll click on Package Manager console. So we've created the model. And what we want to do is add a migration. So a migration is some kind of change to the structure of our database. So we're going to run the command add-migration, and then we give it a name. And then we call the update-database command. So let's see what this does. We'll do these 2 commands one at a time. So first I'm going to write add-migration. We'll say create brand table. So this is just a description of what are we doing in the database? What kind of change are we making? So we're going to create a table based on the brand model we built last week. And the migration name cannot have any spaces. Okay. So type add, and also not case sensitive. Oops. I'll just copy that. So we're going to add a migration called create brand table. So I'll hit enter. Visual Studio recompiles the site. It says if you want to undo this, you can then remove migration. And let's look at what it did here. We now have this file that's time-stamped with the current date and time, and the name of the migration, create brand table. Oh, I messed this up. Okay, that isn't going to do anything. We do need to do one thing first. My bad. I skipped a step. I thought we could skip it. We can't. We're going to do this again. So first go to your Solution Explorer and open up your application DB context file, this file right here in the data folder. So let's open up that file. So we want to declare we're going to declare the brand model here so our database basically has access to it. So we're going to create a DB set of type brand that we're going to call brands, plural. And this object is going to be both readable and writable. So we're going to put this inside our application DB context. Now notice I've got a little error here. I got a red line. Namespace cannot be found. So how would we fix this? So this class doesn't know what our brand model is. Yeah, we just use the using statement. So if I click on my little hint, if I make a reference to the model's namespace, my error goes away. Now I should have done this first before doing the migration step. Because notice when we created that migration, this is blank. There should be some code here to script out the table, because we needed to do this first. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back to my package manager console now. I actually have it as a little tab down at the bottom. So I need to make a second migration. We'll add a migration, create brand table, attempt 2. So I have to make a unique name. I can't use this name create brand table again, because we've already created a migration with that name. So I'm going to make another one and hit enter. And hopefully this should give us a little bit of a different result. Right. So notice the difference now. It's created a new C# file with the new timestamp called create table 2. And notice this, up, migration builder, what's it going to do? It's going to create a table called brands with 3 columns, ID, name, and year. ID is automatically going to get created as a primary key, and it will be set as an identity field. This is like MySQL auto increment. So the values will get assigned automatically. So it's creating a script to run in our database. Now the script hasn't run yet. So you can see under data, we've got these migrations. So it's creating these files here. Here was our first attempt. And here was the second one. So now I need to go back to Package Manager console, and we want to execute this migration, which will build our table called brands. And notice the table name is plural. So in Package Manager console, I'm now going to run the command update-database and hit enter. So it's going to compile the site. It's now going to use the connection string we put in appsettings.json and and it says it's done. So did it work? Well, I'll go back to SSMS. I'm connected to my Azure database. and I'll refresh it. And now if I look at my list of tables, wow, I now have 8 or 9 tables. And I've got a brand table that's plural with 3 columns. And the column names match exactly the names of our model. ID, which is a primary key, name, and year. And all of them are required. They can't be null. You'll notice we got a bunch of other tables here as well. Where the heck did these come from? We didn't do anything to build these tables, so where'd they come from? You're going to use them in a few weeks when you start working with Eduardo with security. When we created the project and we chose individual accounts for authentication, Visual Studio automatically made a migration here that builds all the tables we need for user management. There's a roles table, there's a users table. So we don't even have to build these tables. Visual Studio gives them to us automatically. And as soon as we update the database, that migration ran as well. If you got login failed, Adam, I'm not sure which server you're using. Okay. Yeah, the credential has to be accurate. Yeah, you need a semicolon in your, after each value in app settings.json, right? So server equals server and a semicolon. Database equals database name, semicolon. User space ID equals semicolon. Okay, Marilo, what's your question?
I'm trying to connect here to the database inside the SQL Studio.
Yes.
But I'm not getting the connection. Let me try one thing. Can I share my screen quickly? Or later, or I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, now's probably not the ideal time.
Okay.
So you can't connect at all?
Yeah, I'm trying here. That's okay. I use to keep trying here.
Okay.
Instructions. That's okay.
Cameron, if you're missing the data folder, what that suggests is when you set up the project, you left the authentication as none. So you may want to rebuild to make a new project. So I'll show you, because remember, when I set it up, I chose individual user accounts for authentication. That gives you the data folder with this create identity schema migration and the application DB context. So technically you can add it to a project that doesn't have it, but it's a lot of work. So you're almost better to create a new project and make sure you change the authentication method from none to individual users. So now I've got a table here. Now notice also, let's say I want to make a change, because notice my name, my brand name, it says nvarchar max, which is like thousands of characters. Maybe I don't want the column that big. I can actually change it in Visual Studio and run a new migration to make an update. Okay, thanks for sharing that, Jason. So let's say here on name, I'm going to add another annotation. I'll say max length. We don't want a brand name any longer than 100. So I'm going to add this above my name property. So now if I make a new migration and update the database again, this should update the column length here from max down to 100. So I'm going to make a new migration again. I'm going to go back to Package Manager console. I'll say add migration, brand name max 100. So I'll describe what it is I'm doing. We've added a character limit onto the brand name column. So I'll hit enter. Visual Studio is going to create yet another migration file. And in here, it's going to run an alter column on the name column in the brands table. It's going to set the max length to 100. And now to commit this change to SQL Server, I can run update dash database. Says it's done. Yes, it would, Connor. That's the other benefit. So we're doing two things at once, right? If we generated a form using the brand model and the user put in, let's say they copied and pasted a whole paragraph of text into the name input and tried to save it, the validation would automatically run. So if I go back and refresh again, we should see that now my name is no longer allowing max characters, which I'm not sure how big it is, but I believe it's more than 8,000. It's now limited to 100. Adam, I'm not quite sure what you mean by layering. Could you clarify your question? You could, yes. You don't have to do them one at a time. In fact, our next migration, we're going to build all 5 tables that we need for the store in a single migration. Well, it's up to you. If you want to run a migration for every single database change, you can. Up to you how you do it. But generally, my process is design the models. So we'll design all the models first. We'll declare them all in our application DB context. And then I'll run a single migration that'll take that model, all those models and relationships, and then replicate them all in the database in a single migration. So we don't have to manually create all our model classes and then manually create all of the database tables. Connor, great question. You'll notice it gave me this warning. There's your answer. So what would have happened if we already had data in there? It would have truncated any brand names that were longer. So if we had a brand name with 150 characters, the last 50 characters would have gotten removed from that value. So that's why this warning is highlighted. Now we also have the ability, if you want, you can do the reverse process for a new application. You could build the tables first and then generate your model classes in Visual Studio from your tables. Now it's called the database first model. And I used to do that. If you watch my lessons from 2019, we used that model. We built we generated the database tables, and then we built our models in Visual Studio from it. The model first approach in Visual Studio is probably a lot more standard nowadays using migrations. So if you want to see that, you can watch my YouTube playlist from 2019. But typically now model first is normal. Okay, it is 11:50. We are going to take a pause here for 10 minutes. I'm going to get up and go stretch my legs. I'll try to come back a couple minutes before 12 and offer a little debugging help if I can before we resume with the next hour of class. Okay, so we will take a 10-minute break here.